Hello and welcome to Frank Philosophy, where we speak frankly about philosophy. I'm your host, Frank. I'm a trained philosopher with a MPhil, BA, MPhil, and PhD in philosophy, and I'm an instructor of philosophy at a university far, far away. And in this video, which is our first video, I'd like to go through a text that it's near and dear to my heart. It's called The Value of Philosophy by a fellow named Bertrand Russel. And what we're going to do, basically, and this is the sort of format that I'd like to pursue, at least for texts where I'm not too worried about copyright things, I'm just going to read it and tell you what I think about it along the way. Nice and simple. Because even though it's rather short text, it's only 7 pages total. It's pretty dense. It's a really good example of how to write philosophically and the sort of strategies that philosophers use. Even though it is old, I think the book was published in 1912. It's still admirably clear, and you can get a lot out of it, I think. So we're just going to read it, and that'll be the video. So this chapter, it's the final chapter in a book called The Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russel. Again, Russell is a very important philosopher in the 20th century, very much in the tradition of what philosophers like to call the analytic philosophical tradition. He was a British guy who wrote extensively on things like logic, philosophy of mathematics, a bit of metaphysics, I would say, philosophy of language, and he has some very important ideas that are still, people still talk about him today. But he wrote this book at one point called The Problems of Philosophy, where he sort of introduces many classic problems for philosophy, at least in the Western tradition. Hold on a sec here. Let me just make sure. Okay. Sorry, I had to make sure I'm using the right microphone. So he wrote this introductory textbook about many classic problems in philosophy at the time, and they haven't changed all that much, although the way that we talk about them has changed a bit. But for the final chapter, he wrote a few pages on what he thinks is the value of philosophy. So we're just going to go through and see what old Bert thinks is the value of philosophy. And as we read through it, I'll try to fill in any gaps that might hinder understanding and try and reconstruct his arguments in the most charitable way possible. I don't think they're all equally good or compelling, but hopefully you can get something out of it. This is a text that's written in a style, it's over 100 years old now, right? So even though it's English, it's a bit dated, especially depending on how young you are. But that's where I come in, right, to sort of decode the philosophy and speak frankly on it. I'll get really tired of that pun, so don't worry. Okay, so here we go. Chapter 15, The Value of Philosophy, from The Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russel. So having now come to the end of our brief and very incomplete review of the problems of philosophy, it will be well to consider in conclusion what is the value of philosophy and why it ought to be studied. Now, just right out of the gate here. Probably this should be chapter 1, right? If you get to the end of your book and you say, maybe I should tell the reader why my book is important, or why this topic is worth thinking about, should probably put that front and center. Now, clearly, Bertrand Russell was interested in philosophy, so he doesn't seem to think that it needs any justification. But nevertheless, he did put down a couple pages at the very end to make the case that philosophy is worth thinking about. And I think that's a good place to start for this channel, and that's why I picked this as the first reading that we're going to go through. It is the more necessary to consider this question in view of the fact that many men, under the influence of science or practical affairs, are inclined to doubt whether philosophy is anything better than innocent but useless, trifling, hair-splitting distinctions and controversies on matters concerning which knowledge is impossible. So he says a couple things here, and there are a couple assumptions built into this sentence, right? First of all, notice he's going to talk about men and mankind instead of humans and humankind. Why? Because this text is 100 years old, so that was just much more common back in the day, much less common nowadays. But that's the way he speaks. That's not the way that I will. But just make a note about that. And he thinks that it's common among the population, whether under the influence of science or practical affairs, that people doubt whether philosophy is anything better than innocent but useless trifling. Now, this is really interesting because, many people who don't have an academic bone in their body, so to speak, and who just, swing a hammer for a living, might not be impressed with what philosophers get up to, the goal of philosophy. And I think that's pretty intuitive. That's pretty easy to grasp, that, the everyday person probably doesn't think that philosophy is all that important. But the mention of science here, right, under the influence of science, that's interesting, because, well, even though it's not quite the context that I'm thinking of nowadays, it goes to show that this idea of a life dominated by science is older than we might think, right? We all think nowadays of science as something brandy new, but scientific revolutions, right, which in turn created revolutions in the way that human beings interact and do things, they've been happening for millennia, really. I mean, in the turn of the century, you had things like combustion engines, electricity being more prominent or more common for people. You had transatlantic cables, right? You had ways of communicating that could never have been done before. So you get what's, for lack of a better term, sort of technocracy having developed, even in 1912. Right, or perhaps especially in 1912. At that turn of the century, there were lots of industrial and technological advances being made at a rapid pace. So, it's interesting that he would mention that. And the idea being that, well, if we think of science as, so great and so wonderful, maybe we don't even need to care about philosophy, right? Why bother? It's innocent but useless, trifling, hair-splitting distinctions and controversies on matters concerning which knowledge is impossible. And I think another interesting thing to point out is that, people didn't just start thinking that philosophy is useless. This is a very old idea, right? At least as old as Russell. He was probably, talking to his friends, and they say, "What do you do for a living, Bert?" And he said, "Oh, I teach philosophy." And they, insert jokes about how useless philosophy is, right? He dealt with that, of course, even 100 years ago. And I'll say even in the ancient Chinese tradition, there's a contempt for certain kind of philosophical thinking, even among philosophical traditions like the Confucians. So for example, Xunzi thought that certain types of philosophical inquiry were useless. So this is an old prejudice. And Bert here is just setting it up. He's just setting it up, right? We got to talk about why philosophy is valuable, and it's pretty common for people to think that it's not. So it's really important that we make a case for why it is. Okay. This view of philosophy appears to result partly from a wrong conception of the ends of life and partly from a wrong conception of the kinds of goods which philosophy strives to achieve. So these are two different mistakes. Right? One, or the first mistake, is that you have the wrong idea about what's important in life. Right? If you think that philosophy is useless, when it's really not, then one mistake you could be making is that the good things that I should try to achieve in life have nothing to do with philosophy. Right? That's one mistake you could be making. Right? Another mistake you could be making, the other part, is a wrong conception of the kind of goods that philosophy tries to achieve. Right? So you could just be expecting philosophy to do the wrong thing. Right? You could be expecting things from philosophy that it's not supposed to be doing. Right? You could expect things from philosophy that it's just not designed for. Right? So for example, in the physical sciences, right, through the medium of inventions, it is useful to innumerable people who are wholly ignorant of it. And this is an important contrast, right, between philosophy and physical science, which just means, STEM, right? Where, STEM, the hard sciences, right, the real sciences, are responsible for all sorts of inventions that have made our lives better and totally transformed them. And most people, I will say most people who use and take advantage of all these inventions and developments in the physical sciences have no idea how it works. Right? I don't know how electricity works, and I bet most of you don't either. And that's kind of the point. Thus, the study of physical science is to be recommended not only or primarily because of the effect on the student, but rather because of the effect on mankind in general. Right? So you don't just study science because you can you'll get something out of it, you'll enjoy it, or you'll make money, right? But because if you study science and you learn things about the way the world works and you contribute to the creation of inventions that help improve people's lives, that's satisfying in itself, right? So there could be an altruistic motive to helping produce scientific discoveries, right? Thus, utility does not belong to philosophy, right? If the study of philosophy has any value at all for others than students of philosophy, it must be only indirectly through its effects upon the lives of those who study it. Right, indirectly through its effects upon the lives of those who study it. It is in these effects, therefore, if anywhere, that the value of philosophy must be primarily sought. Okay. So, big disanalogy between philosophy and the sciences. Hold on, how do I have my camera reversed. Okay. Science makes stuff, right, that people use. Philosophy doesn't do that, right? So we can say that science is useful because it makes stuff and it improves people's lives through the stuff that it makes and the discoveries that it makes that can be applied to solving practical problems like, how do we communicate across continents, right? Well, science can create the technology to do that. Philosophy doesn't do any of that stuff, right? So if philosophy is going to have any positive value at all, assuming that that value is the product of the effects that it has on the world at large, then it must be indirect in the sense that it must be through the people who study philosophy that any value is gained, right? So, for example, teachers of philosophy must be responsible for a lot of the value of philosophy itself, right? Insofar as they get people, or that they have some sort of effect on their students or the people who read or listen to or watch or whatever what they do, and it has some positive effect on how those people end up seeing the world, right? It enriches their lives in some way, right? And that's what Russell means by indirect, right? So physical science works through the medium of inventions, but philosophy must act only through its effects upon the philosophers, right? The people who study it. And that's really all we have, right? Philosophy doesn't build anything. There's no inventions of philosophy. It's just, people know it, right? There's no archaeological evidence for philosophy in the same way that there's archaeological evidence for technology developments, right? Okay. But further, if we are not to fail in our endeavor to determine the value of philosophy, we must first free our minds from the prejudices of what are wrongly called practical men. The practical man, as this word is often used, is one who recognizes only material needs, who realizes that men must have food for the body, but is oblivious of the necessity of providing food for the mind. Okay, so this is a really good example of good writing in philosophy. Not to say I agree with what's being said, but here we go. The philosopher introduces a term and then goes to define it, right? So Russell says that there are problems that arise from the so-called practical man, and then he goes on to define the practical man, right? So what is this mistake, right? Because he's setting up that, all these ideas that philosophy is useless and has no value, it's wrong. And he gave us some reasons why, right? Because either it gets things wrong about what's important in life, and it gets things wrong about where the value comes from. And the reason for that is that we have these ideas floating around thanks to the ubiquity of practical men. Now, at a second level here, what he's doing, which is kind of annoying, he's sort of undercutting this definition, right? He's putting practical in scare quotes, right? And he thinks that they're wrongly called practical men, right? And he says that the word is often used, so he's saying kind of contemptuously, right? These so-called practical men is one who recognizes only material needs and who realizes that people must have food for the body, but is oblivious of the necessity of providing food for the mind, right? So defining a term that's going to be important for the rest of what comes next, but also doing so in a sort of backhanded way to make it clear that his sense of practical, which we don't know, at least not yet, is different from the way most people, right, as the word is often used, right? So he's just characterizing what other people are saying and expressing his dissatisfaction with it, but nevertheless he's going with it anyway for the purpose of this discussion, right? So that's like second order issue, right? First order issue is this idea that, okay, there are lots of people call themselves practical men, right? Who don't realize the importance of providing food for the mind, right? Right, meaning people who don't recognize that the value of education, really, right? And he gives this sort of counterfactual or hypothetical example next, right? If all men were well off, if poverty and disease had been reduced to their lowest possible point, there would still remain much to be done to produce a valuable society. And even in the existing world, the goods of the mind are at least as important as the goods of the body, right? So even if everybody was clothed and fed and reasonably well off materially, there would still be a lot to do to make a valuable society Namely, you would have to cultivate people's minds, right? And the claim is that the goods of the mind are at least as important as the goods of the body, right? So having a healthy psychological or mental life is just as important, at least as important, according to Russell, as having a life that's free from chronic hunger, disease, and so on. And it is exclusively among the goods of the mind that the value of philosophy is to be found. And only those who are not indifferent to these goods can be persuaded that the study of philosophy is not a waste of time. So again, now we're going back here, right, to this claim, right, from a wrong conception of the ends of life, right, and these practical, so-called practical people have a wrong conception of the ends or goals of life, or what matters in life. And he says, well, it's because these people don't recognize the goods of the mind, right? That we should strive to live in a way that produces benefit for our mental and intellectual lives as well, right? It's good if people think clearly about things, if people think deeply about things. That's a better society than one in which people only care about keeping their bellies full, right? Okay. Philosophy, like all other studies, aims primarily at knowledge, right? And the knowledge it aims at is the kind of knowledge which gives unity and system to the body of the sciences, and the kind which results from a critical examination of the grounds of our convictions, prejudices, and beliefs. So this is a sort of classic view of philosophy, right? Where the idea is that philosophy is supposed to give us a system or unity to the rest of knowledge, right? So we have the sciences, for example, where there's math, there's physics, there's chemistry, there's biology, right? And the idea is that philosophy is supposed to be at the bottom of all that, or it's supposed to be the glue that ties all that stuff together, right? And it says, what do all of these sciences have in common, right? We say that we learn things because of mathematics, and we learn things about the way numbers work. We learn things about the way electricity works. We learn things about the way the human body works, about medical sciences, right? Things like that. What gives those things unity, right? And those seem like very different topics, and they are very different topics. But we talk about them the same way. We group them together. And philosophy is supposed to give us a sense of why that is, right? Why do we group all those things together? What do they have in common, right? And we get there by critically examining the grounds or the basis of our convictions and prejudices and beliefs, right? So we have lots of beliefs. Biology teaches us about, the way cells work and evolution and ATP and all that stuff, right? And astronomy teaches us about, the life cycle of a star, right? And if we think deeply about, different propositions or ideas within those domains, we might be able to identify commonalities for example, the methods that we use to arrive at claims that we think are true, right? The methods that we use, or the basis, right? The sort of evidence that we care about, or the strategies that we use when we're evaluating two competing theories of how stuff works, right? So philosophy is supposed to be, I want to say it's both higher order but also ground level, right? It's around the sciences. It's not directly in there, and that's part of why it's so tricky. Right? So that's this, and this is a pretty, I would say, common conception of philosophy. But it cannot be maintained that philosophy has had any very great measure of success in its attempt to provide definite answers to its questions. And that's one of the problems, right? If you ask a mathematician, a mineralogist, or a historian, or any other man of learning what definite body of truths has been ascertained by the science, his answer will last as long as you are willing to listen, right? So if you ask a computer scientist, right, what are we learning about AI right now? There's no shortage of things to say, right? But if you put the same question to a philosopher, right, say, what are the, list me the 10 biggest discoveries in philosophy over the last 100 years. He will, if he's candid, have to confess that his study has not achieved positive results such as have been achieved by other sciences. Now, I'll say right now, there are many philosophers who disagree with this. Right? A lot of philosophers think, no, we have made progress. Clearly, the way we think about things now are better than the way that we thought about them in the past. There have been massive developments in philosophy over the last 100 years, and maybe they could even list them for you, right? So not everybody thinks this. But Russell, and he's speaking from a pretty solid position of authority as having been responsible for many big ideas in philosophy over the from the past century. He's saying, well, can't really say much about what we've done. And he gives an account of why, right? He tells us why that is. Why is it that philosophy hasn't really done anything that you can put in a list compared to, say, computer science, right? It is true that this is partly accounted for by the fact that as soon as definite knowledge concerning any subject becomes possible, the subject ceases to be called philosophy and becomes a separate science. So we'll just go with his example, right? The whole study of... Oh, that was a mistake. Sorry about that. The whole study of the heavens, which now belongs to astronomy, was once included in philosophy. Right? Newton's great work was called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. Right? And this is important as a historical claim. Right? So philosophy, even though I said that for a while many people thought that it was useless, at least during the early modern period in Europe, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, even 1800s, there was this idea, right, as science was developing, that what we now call science actually falls under the umbrella of philosophy, right? So Russell gives the great example, right? Isaac Newton, right, the physics guy, right, an astronomer, considered himself a natural philosopher, right? That was the idea. That was the term, right? Now we would call him a scientist, right? But back then, he would have thought of himself as a natural philosopher and a theologian, by the way, right? Newton was very, very dedicated to the idea of God, very much, and that sort of shaped a lot of what was going on in the early modern period and the Enlightenment period, right? The idea that science was done to help one understand the mystery of God's creation, right? That's why you did science, so you could understand creation in a more rich and holy way, really. So it used to be philosophy, but now we just call it astronomy because, well, we know how things work. Right. Similarly, the study of the human mind, which was a part of philosophy, has now been separated from philosophy and has become the science of psychology. Right. So, especially during the 17 and 1800s, when we didn't have things like clinical psychological approaches to mental, well, not even mental disorders, but just how to understand the way the mind works and the way the brain works at all. that was all philosophy, right? You just had to do that by using reason and logic and say, well, if I think hard enough, I can give an account of how things seem to work for me inside of my brain with some, by following some basic rules of logic and if A then B and don't have any contradictions and stuff like that. And that was the best we could do. But eventually we had better methods, methods that involved data eventually, and clinical approaches that focused on interviewing people and identifying tendencies across populations for the way people think, the way the mind works. What else? I don't know, evolution, right? Brain anatomy, things like that. All sorts of science has stepped in and replaced a lot of what was just idle philosophical speculation. Right? Thus, to a great extent, the uncertainty of philosophy is more apparent than real. Right? Those questions which are already capable of definite answers are placed in the sciences, while those only to which at present no definite answer can be given remain to form the residue which is called philosophy. Right? So in this sense, philosophy, you might think, is a victim of its own success, right? Because once the philosophers think hard enough about how to go about answering a question, we can start using scientific methods to answer that question, right? We don't have to speculate anymore, right? We can just use science. Now, there's going to be some questions left over, right? And there's going to be some questions that even science can't answer, and that stuff is what the philosophers look at. That's the residue, which is called philosophy, right? I think a quote that I remember from, 15 years ago, long time ago, of Neil deGrasse Tyson saying that, God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance. The idea being that if we can't explain something, we say, well, God must have been responsible for that. And, I don't agree with that conception of God, but for many or some religious populations, the argument might appeal to you that, well, if we can't explain it, and it doesn't have any good explanation that you or I can understand, then it must be divine or supernatural or godly, right? And Neil deGrasse Tyson says, well, look, we've learned so much, and there are so many things that we couldn't explain before, but now we can. So it seems like your conception of God is just getting smaller and smaller. You can run a similar argument for philosophy, right? Where there were questions that we once had that philosophers were keen on answering, but that problem space has shrunk because science has come along and been able to answer those questions instead. Now, to push back against that, I might also add that in the process of science coming along and answering some questions, new questions arise. And those questions are ripe for philosophical inquiry, right? So, for example, bioethics has emerged as a new area. I mean, I guess it was always around, but the problems have gotten more specific because of technological advancements, right? So things like assisted suicide, abortion, how do we treat people with dementia or with memory issues, right? How do we navigate ethical issues that emerge now that we have the ability to prolong life and to deal with disease and make decisions about human life that we were never able to make before. These are new philosophical questions that emerge only because science has reached a certain point. So, so as some problems go away, right, we don't worry about phlogiston anymore. You can look that up if you like. But we do worry about, abortion, right, which maybe we didn't worry so much about 1,000 years ago when it wasn't as huge of a deal, as widely available as it is now. Right. Okay, so philosophy is the residue. But this is, at best, a partial explanation, right? This is only a part of the truth concerning the uncertainty of philosophy, meaning the inability of philosophy to give concrete, truth-filled answers about the topics that it's focused on, right? So it's not just the residue theory of philosophy. That's Russell thinks that explains some of what's going on. It's certainly historically accurate, but there's still more to it, right? So there are many questions, and among them, those that are of the profoundest interest to our spiritual life, that's important, which, so far as we could see, must remain insoluble to human intellect unless its powers become of a quite different order than what they are now. Right? So, nevertheless, right, even if there are some questions that have gone away because we've, done enough science, right, there are still other questions that that seem impervious to all scientific development, right? So, has the universe any plan or purpose? Or is it a fortuitous concourse of atoms? Right? So does the universe have a purpose? Do I have a purpose? What is the meaning of life? Is science ever going to tell us that? I mean, maybe. Right? But it seems like that one's going to stick around. Right? Is consciousness, right, the fact that you are conscious right now, a permanent part of the universe, giving hope of indefinite growth and wisdom, or it is a transitory accident on a small planet on which life must ultimately become impossible? So this is a tricky way of putting like 4 different questions. Right? Is consciousness a permanent part of the universe, giving hope of the indefinite growth in wisdom, or is it a transitory accident on a small planet on which life must ultimately become impossible? So there are like 3 different questions here. The first is this first question, or this first possibility, is about the soul, right? Is the soul immortal, right? Do we have souls? That's the question, right? Because a very important component of much of, at least, European philosophy is that our consciousness will persist after our bodies die. Right? So our bodies stop working, but our consciousness lives on because our consciousness doesn't live in the body, it lives in the soul, and the soul is something different. So when we die, the soul leaves the body and we will remain conscious. If you're Christian or any other religion that believes in an afterlife, right, then your consciousness will persist even though your body obviously doesn't work anymore, right? So is that true? Right? Is that the case? And if so, of course, Russell, being a perpetual nerd that he is, right, the only thing he cares about, if the soul is permanent and immortal, that he could just keep getting smarter and smarter and wiser, right? The idea that if we were to die and the soul is immortal and we could chit chat with the sages of the past, right? If we could sit down and have a chat with, I don't know, Plato or Jesus, and just get a bit of wisdom from those guys in the afterlife, right? Presuming that assuming that they had some, or had perfect knowledge, I guess, of everything that's happened since they died, or at least since their bodies died, right? And we could become part of that collective wisdom of the afterlife and sort of learn everything and understand everything. Wouldn't that be great? At least Russell seems to suggest that that would be a good outcome, right? So this whole thing is about the soul. Or is it a transitory accident on a small planet on which life must ultimately become impossible? Right? And this is about the meaning of life, right? Where the idea is that, well, if that's not true, then it turns out that we're kind of just aware of ourselves and our surroundings is a kind of accident that, isn't going to last very long. And for as short as our own lives are individually, I don't know, 70 some odd years, maybe 80. Life on Earth in the grand scheme of things will eventually come to an end. And it's very likely that when it does, it'll be like it never happened as far as the universe is concerned, right? When the heat death of well before the heat death of the universe, the climate on Earth might destroy all life eventually for whatever reason. Probably not human-induced climate change. I don't think we'll have that sort of effect on the planet. We could screw up things for ourselves, but eventually there will come a point where all life on Earth is gone for whatever reason, and that's kind of inevitable. So if that's true, what's the meaning of life, really? Are good and evil of importance to the universe or only to man? Right? So, or in other words, is there objective right and wrong? Is there? Such questions are asked by philosophy and variously answered by various philosophers. But it would seem that whether the answers be otherwise discoverable or not, the answers suggested by philosophy are none of them demonstrably true. Meaning, no matter how smart somebody is, it seems like we still disagree about this stuff. Yet, however slight may be the hope of discovering an answer, it is part of the business of philosophy to consider, or to continue the consideration of such questions, to make us aware of their importance, to examine all the approaches to them, and to keep alive that speculative interest in the universe which is apt to be killed by confining ourselves to definitely ascertainable knowledge. So this is, now he's like actually getting into the answer of, what is the actual value of philosophy? And he alludes to it here, right? And this sentence is a mouthful too. Right? So philosophers continue to think about these questions, even if it's not clear that they'll ever have an answer, right? Because one of the things that philosophers do is they make us aware of the importance of the questions, right? To examine all the approaches to them, right? So when I teach an intro to philosophy course, I raise a question like, are moral truths, or do moral truths exist, right? Or is morality objective? And I give a couple responses that really smart, clear-thinking people have given over the years. Now, I have my own preferred theory of whether I think morality is objective. Maybe I'll talk about that some other time. But whether I'm right doesn't really matter. Whether anyone's right doesn't really matter. What matters is these questions are worth thinking about carefully, and maybe there isn't a right or wrong answer to them. But we should act as if there is, and we should take all the possibilities seriously. And that's true for many important questions, whether philosophical or otherwise. Right? And we'll get to that in a bit, but the point here is that, look, the value isn't from just getting the right answer. Yep, morality is objective, right? That doesn't really help anyone, right? Because a lot of people have that answer already. People who believe in religion very much, right, will tend to think that morality is objective, right? It's a function of God. But that's not enough to do philosophy, right? That's just one answer to a question, which many people have different answers to, and they give different arguments for and against. And that's the importance of philosophy, right? That's the value. To take the different approaches seriously and to keep alive that speculative interest in the universe, right? Which maybe things could be the way I think they are, or they could be some other way. Don't really know, right? And that speculative interest is apt to be killed by confining ourselves to definitively ascertainable knowledge, right? So if I only care about things with a yes or no answer, and I just try and figure out, after a certain amount of effort, is it yes or is it no? Is it true or is it false? Is it right or is it wrong? And that's it. That's how I go through life. Russell thinks that that's the attitude that kills curiosity, right? Or speculative interest. Okay. Many philosophers, it is true, have held that philosophy could establish the truth of certain answers to such fundamental questions, right? And this is a point, right, where people who have thought very clearly and carefully about these questions have thought that they have the right answer, right? So people who, to give another example of moral objectivity, theologians who were convinced that right and wrong is determined by God, they didn't just say that, right? They wanted to give arguments for why that is. And they believed that the way you get there is by doing philosophy or by doing logic, by thinking things through using rigorous argumentation, right? They had supposed that what is of most important in religious beliefs could be proved by strict demonstration to be true. In order to judge of such attempts, it is necessary to take a survey of human knowledge and to form an opinion as to its methods and its limitations. Right, so this is he puts a lot into these sentences. That's why I think it's really important to walk through this with somebody who can fill in these blanks, and that's what I'm trying to do here. Right, so like I said, religious beliefs, for example, trying to give arguments for religious beliefs. This was one of the main tasks of philosophy in Europe for many, many years, centuries. Right, philosophy and theology are like this. Nope, there we are. In order to judge of such attempts, it's necessary to take a survey of human knowledge and to form an opinion as to its methods and limitations. Right, so again, the idea of looking at all knowledge that we have, whether it's religious, whether it's scientific, whether it's ethical, whether it's practical, right? And figure out, how do we arrive at any knowledge, right? What does all knowledge have in common? That's one of the key questions of philosophy. And Russell says, on such a subject, it would be unwise to pronounce dogmatically. But if the investigations of our previous chapters have not led us astray, we shall be compelled to renounce the hope of finding philosophical proofs of religious beliefs. Right, so Russell is sort of famously against dogma and religion. He has a book, I'm pretty sure it's called Why I Am Not a Christian. A pretty ballsy title, I guess, if I do say so myself. So he has no sympathy for religion, although he seems, maybe, what does he say? What is it? There it is. The spiritual life. So maybe Russell falls under the spiritual but not religious type, right? Definitely not a fan of dogmatic religion, at any rate, right? And again, if the investigations of our previous chapters have not led us astray, again, this book is called The Problems of Philosophy. And just like as I mentioned before, right, this is a very common way of approaching or introducing philosophy, is introducing the problems that it's focused on, right? Introducing its not the answers to a set of questions, but the problems that comprise it, right? And the different answers, and we don't say like, well, this answer has a couple problems, and this answer has a couple problems, and this other answer could combine the benefits of these, combine the virtues of these two approaches, and get rid of the problems of those two approaches. But still, there are these other problems with this answer, right? And that's sort of how philosophy is done, right? We cannot therefore include as part of the value of philosophy any definite set of answers to such questions. Hence, once more, the value of philosophy must not depend upon any supposed body of definitely ascertainable knowledge to be acquired by those who study it. Right? So, again, right, it's not about finding answers to questions. It's about, the questions themselves. It's about thinking deeply about the possible answers to these questions and pursuing those answers as far as we can. That's really the purpose. And as a result, the value of philosophy is, in fact, to be sought largely in its uncertainty. Right? So again, it's the focus on the problems themselves and the fact that people have all sorts of different answers to these very deep and important problems that it doesn't seem like there's any easy way of solving or resolving. The man who has no tincture of philosophy goes through life imprisoned in the prejudices derived from common sense, from the habitual beliefs of his age or his nation, and from convictions which have grown up in his mind without the cooperation or consent of his deliberate reason. So this is, eventually we're going to do Descartes on this channel, and this is a very Cartesian worry, although it's not just Descartes, but this is a common worry among famous philosophers that most of what people know or claim to know in their everyday acting is not really held to a very high standard, right? A lot of the things that we claim we know, we learn from sources that aren't very reliable. We just sort of believe things because they seem to be true to us, right? Or they're formed by habit, or nowadays they're shaped by media and by social media, which is not good at all, right? So it's actually more important than ever to think philosophically about things and to try to arrive at a more promising foundation for the things that we think that we know. Because very often we learn things in spite of our ability to think rationally, right? From convictions which have grown up in the mind without the cooperation or consent of deliberate reason. So we just believe things without really thinking about them, I'm sure you can think of examples. To such a man, the world tends to become definite, finite, and obvious. Right, and that's the interesting thing here, right? Very often philosophers, some of them have very strong opinions, but typically people who think deeply about difficult questions recognize that we really can't be too committed to our answers about really important questions, which is not a great thing to say. But when you just recognize that there are lots of really important things that we'd really like to have a definite answer, but reasonable people disagree about them, there's only so much confidence we can have in our own answers. And if we don't entertain that possibility, then things look definite or obvious, right? Common objects rouse no questions, and unfamiliar possibilities are contemptuously rejected. But as soon as we begin to philosophize, on the contrary, we find, as we saw in our opening chapters, that even the most everyday things lead to problems which only very incomplete answers can be given. Right? So even the most basic things can become philosophically interesting if we're willing to question our basic assumptions about them. Right? I think it was St. Augustine who had the line, about time, right? Time. The more I think about it, the less I understand it, right? And that's true for many topics in philosophy, right? Things can seem pretty obvious when we don't think about them, but as soon as we start thinking about them, things get messy, right? So philosophy, though unable to tell us with certainty what is the true answer to the doubts which it raises, is able to suggest many possibilities which can enlarge our thoughts and free them from the tyranny of custom. Right? The tyranny of custom being this stuff up here. Our habits, what the people around us believe, what my neighbor thinks, right? The people who are responsible for our beliefs in spite of our ability to reason. Right? Thus, while diminishing our feelings of certainty as to what things are, it greatly increases our knowledge as to what they may be. That's quotable. That's nice. That's nice. It removes the somewhat arrogant dogmatism of those who had never traveled into the region of liberating doubt, and it keeps alive our sense of wonder by showing familiar things in an unfamiliar aspect. That's nice. I'm going to highlight that. That's really nice. I need a better color, actually. Yellow? Oh, come on, Mac. Oh, yeah, that's a little better. Thus, while diminishing our feelings of certainty as to what things are, it greatly increases our knowledge as to what they may be. Now, I love that for many reasons, but he's saying it in the context of sort of knowledge about the world, and the philosophical problems that he's talking about are kind of abstract, right? And even though they have everyday beginnings, right? What is time? And the philosophy of time gets very obscure and very abstract very quickly, even though time is something that we all kind of have a sense of what it is. But there's also an ethical dimension to this claim, right? Where while diminishing our feelings of certainty as to what things are, and you can add in as to what things are right and wrong, it greatly increases our knowledge as to what they may be, right? So what might instead be right or wrong? Or for society at large, right? The way things work in society, philosophy might be able to tell us the way things could be if we were to do things differently, right? There's also this idea that doubt is liberating. Maybe he comes out and says it a little later on, but this is the first introduction of the idea. And he's got this sort of running analogy of dogmatic, uncritical acceptance of beliefs as they're just given to us is a type of imprisonment, right? It shackles us. It binds us to a perception of the way the world is that is just so narrow and limited compared to one we could get if we were unattached to one particular way of seeing the world and we were open to different possibilities of addressing even the most important questions. Keeps alive our sense of wonder by showing familiar things in an unfamiliar aspect. And how many times have you done that, right? You walk past the same tree on the way home from work every day, and then all of a sudden you look at it one day a little bit closer, and you just realize, oh man, I bet this thing is a good 50 years old. That's pretty old. Maybe even older than that. And you really notice the details about it. You appreciate it more, rather than just seeing it as, a thing you walk past. Apart from its utility in showing unsuspected possibilities, philosophy has a value, perhaps its chief value. Okay, so now we're talking about the chief value, through the greatness of the objects which it contemplates, and the freedom from the narrow and personal aims resulting from this contemplation. And the freedom from narrow and personal aims resulting from this contemplation. There's a bit of, was that amphibole? I think that's the word, where you could parse this sentence in a couple different ways. Now, the freedom from narrow and personal aims, right? That's the noun phrase, resulting from this contemplation. The life of the instinctive man is shut up within the circle of his private interests. His family and friends may be included, but the outer world is not regarded except as it may help or hinder what comes within the circle of instinctive wishes. Now, family and friends was the circle way back when, but now we have social media, we have online presences, we have our social media presence, and we curate those in groups as well that sort of shut us up within a circle, right? Within a private circle, which we create through our follows and engagements and likes and things like that, right? And we look at others through this lens as people who are either on our team or against it. Right? In such a life, there is something feverish and confined, in comparison with which the philosophic life is calm and free. I agree with that. The private world of instinctive interests is a small one, set in the midst of a great and powerful world, which must sooner or later lay our private world in ruins. Well, there you go. Oof. That one hits a little hard. Right? Our lives are pretty small. They're pretty small. And eventually, life gets the better of us. Right? And the power of life is very difficult for us to comprehend. And if it ever decides to go against us, our goose is cooked. It'll win every time, right? We get some disease, some war breaks out. So if something comes along to ruin our day that's outside of our control, it's going to win most of the time, right? And this illusion that, our own little world that we create when we have our own set of beliefs that aren't subject to any change or revision. The idea that that's going to be maintained throughout our life and will lead us to the best possible life, that's just an illusion, and it's a destructive one, according to Russell. Unless we could so enlarge our interests as to include the world, or as to include the whole outer world, we remain like a garrison in a beleaguered fortress, knowing that the enemy prevents escape and that ultimate surrender is inevitable. In such a life there is no peace, but a constant strife between the insistence of desire and the powerlessness of the will. In one way or another, if our life is to be great and free, we must escape this prison and this strife. Again, so he's got this really nice analogy that sort of goes through the whole chapter of a life committed to things being a certain way, committed to a certain way of perceiving the world, a certain set of values that aren't subject to change or revision. As a prison, really, it's a prison. Whereas, the alternative is a life that is great and free. Right? One way of escape is by philosophic contemplation. Philosophic contemplation does not, in its widest survey, divide the universe into two hostile camps, friends and foes, helpful and hostile, good and bad. It views the whole impartially. And this, I think, is true. Right? The more philosophy you do and the more complicated you realize, many questions are, especially those that are most important, the less hostilely you view those who might disagree with you, right? Once you realize that there are 10 different possible answers to this very difficult question, and each of those 10 has a lot of serious mental horsepower behind them, right, and lots of care and thought, then you don't really end up so committed to your own beliefs quite as much, right? Because you realize, well, I could be wrong, right? Maybe this other person is right. The way I see things right now, I think that, X is the answer, right? But it could be Y, right? It could be Y. I'm not sure. Philosophic contemplation, when it is unalloyed, does not aim at proving that the rest of the universe is akin to man. All acquisition of knowledge is an enlargement of the self. And that's an important new metaphor that gets introduced here. But this enlargement is best attained when it is not directly sought. So don't go eating a bunch of food to enlarge the self, I guess. Maybe that's the point here. It is obtained when the desire for knowledge is alone operative, by a study which does not wish in advance that its objects should have this or that character, but adapts the self to the characters which it finds in its objects. Okay, that's a mouthful. Actually, I'm going to turn off the highlighting. I really only wanted the highlighting for those few good lines before. But this is a mouthful, right? So you don't want to directly try to enlarge the self, right? The idea is to just pursue the truth, to try to increase your knowledge, whatever the answer may be, whatever it may be, right? So if you want to learn more about something, you shouldn't go into that process with any preconceived notion about what you want the answer to be, right? Instead, you want to adapt yourself to the characters which it finds in its objects, right? So if you're trying to learn about something, you don't want to approach it with an attitude of, well, I need to make sure I find a certain answer, right? That's not the way to properly enlarge oneself. Right? This enlargement of self is not obtained when, taking the self as it is, we try to show that the world is so similar to the self that knowledge of it is possible without any admission of what seems alien. So this is like kind of a very blank insert adjective here. But basically what I get out of this is a worry about something like confirmation bias, right? Where very often we find ourselves learning, quote unquote, things where we already know the answer to them, right? We tend to focus, especially in the age of social media, on only viewing things and learning about things that we already have very strong opinions on and that we've already formed a conclusion about, right? So we can learn things without actually learning things, right? Getting new reasons to believe what you already believe, or being having your bias sort of promoted is not really the kind of learning that philosophy is interested in, right? Instead, and he tells us why, right? To show that the world is so similar to the self that knowledge is possible without any admission of what seems alien. This is like kind of how we all function on social media, right? We follow only what we want to follow. We see only what we want to see. And eventually the algorithm gives us only what we've decided on, and what, the algorithm, our feeds, become a reflection of ourselves, right? Not an enlargement of it, but a reflection of it. And so we don't actually learn anything. We don't actually grow as people. That's the problem, right? The desire to prove this as a form of self-assertion. And like all self-assertion, it is an obstacle to the growth of self which it desires, and of which the self knows that it is capable, right? So again, right, if you just have on your news feed or social media, your Twitter, your Facebook, or whatever, a bunch of stuff that you already agree with from a bunch of people that you already agree with, even if you see things that you haven't seen before, you're not actually learning anything, you're not actually growing. You're just having your biases, reaffirmed. Self-assertion in philosophic speculation, as in elsewhere, views the world as a means to its own ends. Thus it makes the world of less account than self, and self sets the bounds to the greatness of its goods. Kind of just a more complex way of saying what I think I already said. In contemplation, on the contrary, we start from not the self, or we start from the not self, and through its greatness, the boundaries of self are enlarged. Through the infinity of the universe, the mind which contemplates it achieves some share in infinity. That's kind of nice. Also, I need to read it again. In contemplation, on the contrary, we start from the not self, right? We start from the unknown, right? From things that we don't have any view or confidence about. And through the greatness of the not self, right? Through the greatness of the universe, the boundaries of the self are enlarged. We become part of the universe by recognizing its otherness, right? By recognizing it not being part of us, right? By recognizing it as being something different and unique and something that we need to learn about and expand ourselves in order to reach it. And when we do that, through the infinity of the universe, the mind which contemplates it achieves some share in infinity. Very cool. Very cool. For this reason, greatness of soul is not fostered by those philosophies which assimilate the universe to man. Okay. This part. Now he's going to start talking about different philosophical views. But he's going to do it in a very oblique way. So, if this passage seems a bit precise in what it's talking about, it's because it is. Right. Knowledge. Let me turn off the highlighter. Oh, now it's off. Knowledge is a form of union of self and not self. Like all union, it is impaired by dominion or domination, and therefore by any attempt to force the universe into conformity with what we find in ourselves. Right. Again, to put it back in the language we've been using, right? Just approaching the world as something that needs to be, organized in a way that we already think it should be organized, right? So some new information comes and you say, oh, I know what to do with that. Let me put that, I already have that categorized. Don't have to think too much about it. That thing over there is bad, right? Or that thing over there is good. Don't need to think twice, right? And we sort of force the universe in conformity with what we already believe. And that is anathema to knowledge. That's the idea. There's a widespread philosophical tendency towards the view which tells us that man is the measure of all things, that truth is man-made, that space and time and the world of universals are properties of the mind, and that if there be anything not caused by the mind, it is unknowable and of no account to us. So, there's a couple different views that he's sort of arguing against here, or at least setting up a criticism of here. And it would probably take a little too much time to explain all of them, and I'll probably do videos or talks about them in the future. But just very briefly, right, this idea that man is the measure of all things, that's a very old idea. That is a sort of skeptical idea. So these ideas basically fall under a kind of skepticism or idealism or subjectivism. Those are like the three isms that, and there are probably some others too that I'm not thinking of right now. But those three kind of are captured by this characterization, where the idea is that, well, maybe we can't really know anything about the world, right? And this is not a crazy position. In fact, it's a very serious one. It's a very serious one, right? The idea is that, look, we walk around and we think that we know things. We're comfortable saying that we know all sorts of things about the world, whether it's, I know how to get to school, or I know that 2 + 2 is 4, or I know that Pluto is no longer a planet. And when we think about what we mean by that, when we say we know things, we find out that none of the answers are very good. None of the answers for why we believe that we know things are actually very compelling. So when we actually start doing philosophy about some very basic questions, we end up with the conclusion that there's no good answer. All the answers fail. And if all the answers fail, then maybe the assumption is wrong. Right? Maybe we don't actually know anything. Right? That's kind of like how skepticism comes about. Right? The idea that any argument in favor of knowledge, for example, is just going to fail. Right? And all the ones that we've tried so far have all failed. So maybe just in principle, we don't actually know things. Maybe we just don't know things. And there are various ways that philosophers have tried to accept that, but also explain common sense and explain how things work anyway. So David Hume is one, and probably the biggest proponent of this view in particular, right? That space and time in the world of universals are properties of the mind. That is called idealism, and that comes from, at least its most prominent presentation, most famous or infamous, is from a guy named George Berkeley, spelt like Berkeley, but pronounced Barclay. And I'll definitely do a talk about him later on. Super fascinating reading there. But anyway, Bert here is not impressed. He's not impressed with subjectivism or idealism or skepticism, right? And he's argued against it in previous chapters in the book, right? This view, if our previous discussions were correct, is untrue. But in addition to being untrue, it has the effect of robbing philosophic contemplation of all things that give it value, since it fetters contemplation to self. So he's sort of making a philosophical argument or a conceptual argument sort of motivated by I want to say ethical argument, right? Or a value argument. The idea that it's good to enlarge the self and pursue knowledge, that's like a moral claim, right? That's a claim about how the world should be, about what sorts of values we should have, right? And this philosophical view, which I'm going to call idealism, or the idea that, everything that we think we know is kind of just made up by us, and there's no really good answer for why things appear to us the way they are that's objective and true. We just sort of make things up as we go. He thinks that as a philosophical view, makes it impossible for us to really achieve knowledge. So this philosophical view of idealism has the same practical results as curating your social media page by yourself and only seeing stuff that you agree with, right? So it's sort of an extension of idealism and skepticism and subjectivism. What it calls knowledge is not a union with the not-self, or a union of the self with the not-self, but a set of prejudices, habits, and desires making an impenetrable veil between us and the world beyond. The man who finds pleasures in such a theory of knowledge is like a man who never leaves the domestic circle for fear his word might not be law, right? Again, and here's the analogy, right? So here it is precisely, right? Somebody who believes this as a theory of knowledge, right? This idea that there's nothing objective, we're just sort of making things up as we go. It's like somebody who, never reads a news article they don't agree with, right? The true philosophic contemplation, on the contrary, finds satisfaction in every enlargement of the not self, in everything that magnifies the objects contemplated, and thereby the subject contemplating. Right? So the idea is that, well, if you're really doing philosophy, then you sort of don't care about the answers, you just care about the outcome of enlarging the self and uniting with the universe in a way that's deep and meaningful. Everything in contemplation that is personal or private, everything that depends upon habit, self-interest, or desire, distorts the object, and hence impairs the union which the intellect seeks. By thus making a barrier between subject and object, such personal and private things become a prison to the intellect. The free intellect will see as God might see, without a here and now, without hopes and fears, without the trammels of customary beliefs and traditional prejudices, calmly, dispassionately, in the sole and exclusive desire of knowledge. Knowledge as impersonal, as purely contemplative, and as it is possible for a man to attain. Right? So again, this idea that a life of habit, custom, and subjectivity, and just thinking that you're always right, and that there's no objective reality beyond, or there's no objective possibility of things being different from how you might perceive them, how that is sort of intellectually, morally, and spiritually not so good. It's pretty small-minded. Hence also the free intellect will value more the abstract and universal knowledge into which the accidents of private history do not enter. Then the knowledge brought by the senses and dependent, as such knowledge must be, upon an exclusive and personal point of view and a body whose sense organs distort as much as they reveal. Right? So, again, it's about cultivating a humility. Right? It's about thinking that, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe some of these answers that I've always thought were correct about this very deep and important question, maybe it's not so correct. Again, very prominent in Western philosophy, right? The sense organs are not always trustworthy, meaning the stuff we see can sometimes be illusory, right? The mind, which has become accustomed to the freedom and impartiality of philosophic contemplation, will preserve something of the same freedom and impartiality in the world of action and emotion. So, okay. Now we're taking the final turn, and this is, we're getting close to the end, right? This is the last couple paragraphs here. And now we're getting to the practical stuff, finally, right? So far, the idea has just been that philosophical knowledge can improve our lives by getting us out of habitual and small ways of thinking, and can enrich our conception of ourselves and our place in the universe by helping us to appreciate its complexity and magnitude, right? But it doesn't only do that, right? That's not just, there aren't just intellectual benefits, right? It's not just intellectual freedom that philosophy gives us access to when we are liberated from habit. In the realm of action and emotion, that happens too, right? A mind, it is the mind which has become accustomed to the freedom and impartiality of philosophic contemplation, will view its purposes and desires as parts of the whole, with the absence of insistence that results from seeing them as infinitesimal fragments in a world which all the rest is unaffected by any one man's deeds, right? So once you just appreciate how big and messy and complex the world is, how small our own perspective is, how wrong we probably are given our limited perspective. Once you recognize that, sort of the absurdity of our situation and just how limited most of us are and what we can actually control, it's freeing in a way, and it gives you a powerful impartiality as well. The impartiality which in contemplation is the unalloyed desire for truth is the very same quality of mind which in action is justice, and in emotion is that universal love which can be given to all and not only to those who are judged useful or admirable. So again, once you liberate yourself from common sense and your commitment to one way of seeing the world and no other, in philosophical things, right, that can translate into ethical and interpersonal interactions, into that domain as well, right? And when you do that and you focus only on the truth, which is conditioned in large part by the idea that things are very big and indifferent to us who are very small and limited, you can be a little more compassionate to others. And that's a really good thing. That's a really good thing, right? We want to act in ways that are just and love everybody, even if we don't like them, right? Because we recognize our very small place in the world. Once we recognize our own very small place in the world, we can recognize that of others and, realize that we're all in this together and we should be good to each other. Right? Thus, contemplation enlarges not only the objects of our thoughts, but also the objects of our actions and our affection. It makes us citizens of the universe, not only of one walled city at war with all the rest. In this citizenship of the universe consists man's true freedom and his liberation from the thraldom of narrow hopes and fears. That's some good stuff right there. That is nice. That's powerful. That's powerful. That's why I read this stuff. That's how philosophy, when you enlarge your perspective about the way things could be, even with stuff that seems utterly abstract and difficult and esoteric, if you maintain that attitude and you practice it and you cultivate it, it'll allow you to appreciate other elements of human life and enrich your relationships with others as a result. And I think that is a real important value of philosophy, that it does that. Thus, to sum up our discussion of the value of philosophy, philosophy is to be studied, not for the sake of any definite answers to its questions, since no definite answer can, as a rule, be known to be true, but rather for the sake of the questions themselves, because these questions enlarge our conception of what is possible, enrich our intellectual imagination, and diminish the dogmatic assurance which closes the mind against speculation. But above all, because, through the greatness of the universe which philosophy contemplates, the mind also is rendered great, and becomes capable of that union with the universe which constitutes its highest good. Yeah. Ooh, that's a good one. Man, I love this piece. 7 pages. Not that much. But, so there it is. That's the value of philosophy, according to Bertrand Russel. I think that's all. I hope you enjoyed. Again, this was a proof of concept, so we'll see, if people like this video. If you do, let me know, and I'll make more. I like making these videos, so and I look forward to doing more. Again, I have to be a little, I'd love the idea of just reading philosophy papers and walking people through what they say, but I have to worry about some copyright stuff. So for now, I'm doing really safe stuff. That's this is what do you call public domain, this book and this version of it, and I'll post a link to it on Gutenberg, which is where this is from, and I've just put the format a little bit nicer in a PDF version, but I'll link to the Project Gutenberg version so you can read that yourself if you'd like to, and I hope this video helped you understand what was going on here and see some of the value in philosophy. As I said, even though it's the last chapter of his book on the problems of philosophy, I think it's probably the most important thing to recognize before you start studying philosophy is what's the value, what's the purpose of it. It can't just be, well, I like it. So that's why I wanted to do it as my first video. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed.